Big Shaq never expected that hiring a quiet maid would change his life forever. One late night he caught Delilah Hartman doing something no one could explain, and what he chose to do next sparked a storm no fortune could shield him from. In a world sharpened by prejudice and betrayal, one silent promise would become a battle for dignity, justice, and redemption. Some lights are meant to burn, even when the world tries its hardest to blow them out. This is not just a story about helping, it's about fighting for the soul you didn't know you were losing. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was a rare, quiet afternoon in the heart of Windermere, Florida, where the sun painted the sprawling mansions in shades of gold and white. Behind the black wrought iron gates that guarded Shaquille O'Neal's estate, life moved with an almost eerie stillness. To the world, Big Shaq was a giant among men, a towering icon of success, charisma, and endless generosity. Yet within the high walls and manicured lawns, an invisible loneliness gnawed at the edges of his luxurious existence. Money filled his closets, fame crowded his phone, but something essential, something human, always felt just out of reach. The house itself seemed to sigh under the weight of wealth. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath crystal chandeliers, yet no laughter bounced off the walls. The kitchens gleamed, but meals were often taken alone. Staff members, paid handsomely, moved with mechanical precision, heads bowed, mouths sealed. The mansion was a kingdom, but Big Shaq walked it like a king without heirs, without confidants, just trophies and faded memories to keep him company. When Shawnee left, she took more than just her own heart. She took the last threads of real conversation, of home. His children visited, of course bringing light with them, but even their joyful energy couldn't plug the void. Friends came by, celebrities, athletes, businessmen, but there was a transactional glaze over it all. Everyone loved Big Shaq, but few knew Shaquille, and fewer still cared to ask. Hiring help wasn't new. Assistants, gardeners, maids, all vetted, all professional, all forgettable. That's why when the agency sent a young woman named Delilah Hartman, Shaq barely noticed at first. He signed the paperwork without looking at her file, trusting the polished smile of the agency manager. New staff didn't excite him anymore. They came, did their jobs, clocked out. That was the rhythm. Clean, predictable, unemotional. Delilah was different, though nobody said it out loud. She moved through the mansion quietly, almost reverently, as if every corner of his home held sacred history. Her hands worked quickly, but gently, dusting away neglect without disturbing the spirit of the place. She didn't chatter or flirt, or gossip with the other staff. She didn't linger for tips or favors. In fact, she almost seemed to shrink whenever Shaq entered a room, her eyes dropping, posture stiffening. Not out of fear, but something deeper, a shield, a memory. Shaq wasn't the kind of man to pry. He respected people's space the same way he guarded his own. Yet even he couldn't deny the tiny prickle of curiosity that Delilah stirred. It wasn't her beauty, though she was striking in a raw, unpolished way, with storm-gray eyes and sun-worn skin. It was something else, a kind of hunger she couldn't hide, a weight she carried like an invisible backpack. She wasn't just working, she was surviving. Days blurred into each other. Shaq threw himself into charity meetings, basketball clinics, endorsement calls, the usual distractions. But late one afternoon, as the sun dipped and threw slanted shadows across his home, he caught a glimpse of her through the courtyard arch. Delilah was standing by the kitchen window, the last rays of sunlight threading through her hair. She wasn't cleaning, she wasn't resting, she was reading. A battered, dog-eared textbook lay open on the counter, her fingers tracing the lines like a blind woman feeling her way towards something she once knew. He didn't disturb her. He watched for a heartbeat longer than was polite, then turned away. The image burned into his mind. A maid studying in a millionaire's mansion. It didn't fit the story the world expected. It didn't fit the quiet, invisible role the staff usually played. It hinted at secrets no resume could explain. That night, as the mansion fell into its usual polished silence, Shaq sat alone in his massive leather armchair, staring at the darkened windows. The world outside his gates buzzed with ambition, pain, injustice, and he was insulated from most of it. But Delilah's presence was a reminder that not everyone had been given the second, third, fourth chances he had. Some people were still clawing their way up, fingernails bleeding, silent and unseen. A low hum of unease threaded itself into his chest. It wasn't pity he felt. It was recognition. The next morning, he paid closer attention. Delilah's uniform was crisp, but her shoes were worn at the soles. Her hands were steady, but the nails were broken, calloused. She moved with grace, but there was a limp in her step she tried to hide. Something about her made the air feel heavier, like the mansion itself was holding its breath. Shaq knew enough about struggle to recognize the marks it left. He had fought his way out of backstreet courts, through systemic bias, through public humiliation. He knew the smell of desperation dressed up as humility. But where he had powerful allies and golden opportunities, Delilah had nothing but a broom, a mop, and a textbook she could only read in stolen moments. By week's end, rumors began to slither among the staff. Delilah was ambitious, they whispered, not satisfied with her place. Some even joked darkly about her aiming higher than her station. The cruelty hung in the air like smoke, sharp, poisonous. Shaq hated that smell. He had lived it before. It was the scent of people trying to put you back in a box they decided you belonged in. He said nothing, for now, but he watched. He watched the way Delilah braced herself before entering a room, the way she nodded too quickly when given orders, as if afraid to be seen as difficult, the way she touched that ragged book hidden deep in her cleaning cart, fingers brushing it like a talisman. There was more to Delilah Hartman than anyone here wanted to see. And Big Shaq, the man the world thought was only a giant in body, was about to prove he was a giant in heart too. He just didn't know it yet. The clock's steady ticking filled the vast halls of the mansion, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. It was nearly midnight, and Big Shaq found himself wandering the echoing corridors, unable to shake a restlessness that clung to his skin like Florida's humid air. Sleep had eluded him more and more lately. He told himself it was business pressures, old injuries flaring up, maybe too much caffeine before bed. But deep down he knew it was something else. A gnawing feeling that something in his life was shifting, just slightly, just enough to keep his soul unsettled. Tonight the house felt different. Not haunted, exactly. Shaq didn't believe in ghosts, but alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. A faint noise floated through the halls, almost hidden beneath the house's natural creaks and groans. A soft scrape, the faint rustle of paper, then a hush, like someone breathing carefully, willing themselves invisible. Shaq paused, instincts prickling. His size had always made him a silent observer when he chose to be. He knew how to move through a room without becoming part of it, knew how to spot the quiet details others missed. He slipped down the stairs, barefoot, heart steady but alert, following the faint trail of sound like a hound scenting the air. The kitchen lights were off, except for a low golden glow spilling from under the pantry door. Not the cold, sterile overheads the staff usually flicked on while working. This was different. Warmer, more human. Shaq approached carefully, pressing one massive hand lightly against the doorframe. He expected to find someone stealing, maybe a staff member slipping food, pocketing supplies. It had happened before, not often, but enough that he knew not to jump to anger. People did desperate things when nobody was looking. He understood that better than anyone. He eased the door open an inch. What he saw stopped him cold. There, hunched over the butcher block counter, was Delilah Hartman, the same gray-eyed maid who had been a ghost during the day, always moving quietly, always keeping her head down. But tonight, she wasn't cleaning. She wasn't resting. She wasn't even eating. She was studying. A heavy nursing textbook lay splayed open, its spine cracked from use, its pages inked with frantic notes in the margins. Delilah clutched a stub of a pencil, her brow furrowed, lips moving soundlessly as she committed anatomical terms to memory. Around her, a battered spiral notebook overflowed with scribbles, practice tests, dreams laid bare in ballpoint pen. Shaq leaned back, heart thudding not with anger, but with a fierce, unexpected swell of emotion. She wasn't stealing. She wasn't wasting time. She was clawing her way toward a future that had been slammed out of reach. Here, in the dead hours of the night, after scrubbing floors and washing windows, she was still fighting, still believing. He hadn't expected it to hit him so hard. A punch to the chest. Memories came rushing. His own late nights as a teenager, shooting free throws alone under flickering gym lights because no one believed he would ever be more than a big body taking up space. Coaches who laughed at his dreams, teachers who side-eyed his potential. He had clawed his way out through talent and stubbornness, but it was luck too. Breaks most people never got. Delilah was chasing something almost no one would see. No camera crews. No roaring crowds. No million-dollar contracts waiting at the finish line. Just a life less burdened. A chance to stand taller. A dream not yet killed. Shaq watched her for a few minutes more. An ache building under his ribs. She was whispering definitions under her breath, correcting herself, starting again. The determination radiating off her was almost blinding. It was the purest kind of ambition. Not greedy, not showy, just survival, polished into hope. A floorboard creaked under his weight. Delilah's head snapped up, her face whitening with horror, as she spotted him in the doorway. In a split second she slammed the textbook shut and stood, posture rigid, expecting punishment, humiliation, maybe worse. But Shaq didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once, slow and deliberate, and backed away, letting the door fall gently closed between them. Upstairs he sat on the edge of his bed, heart hammering against his ribs. He stared into the dark for a long time, wrestling with a storm he hadn't anticipated. He could have fired her, could have called the agency, demanded a replacement, protected the sterile, silent perfection of his home. But something in him rebelled against the very thought. Delilah didn't need punishment. She needed a shot. And maybe, just maybe, Shaq needed to be part of something real again. Something messier and riskier than charity events, or polished public appearances. Something that reminded him why he had fought so hard to become the man he was. As the hours bled toward dawn, a plan began to take shape in his mind. He would find a way to help her. Quietly, carefully, without humiliating her, without turning her into a project or a headline. But he knew, deep in his bones, that helping someone climb was never simple. It meant getting tangled in their struggle. It meant exposing yourself to the same risks, the same ugly backlash. It meant making enemies you didn't even know you had. Big Shaq had faced giants on the court. He had faced critics, injuries, betrayals. But what lay ahead would be a different kind of fight, one he couldn't win with size or fame alone. And though he didn't know it yet, helping Delilah would unleash a storm that would test everything he thought he knew about loyalty, justice, and the weight of one simple choice. The first shot had already been fired, a pencil scratching against paper in the dead of night, and there was no turning back. The days that followed moved like slow-turning gears inside a forgotten clock. Big Shaq went about his routine with the same outward ease, signing autographs, fielding business calls, working out in his private gym. But under the surface, something had shifted. His eyes, once casually observant, now sharpened whenever Delilah passed through his line of sight. He began to notice things he had never bothered to look for before. The weary set of her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly after long hours on her feet, the quiet murmurs she offered to herself when she thought no one could hear. She wasn't just working. She was surviving a daily battle invisible to the privileged world she served. Information came to him in scraps, pieces gathered not by interrogation but by quiet observation. Delilah was careful, almost ruthlessly private, but hardship left fingerprints even the most guarded couldn't wipe clean. Her clothes, neatly pressed but worn thin at the elbows and cuffs, spoke of thrift store finds and nights spent mending torn seams. The way she stretched grocery lists, counted every penny from her modest paycheck, revealed a life balanced on a razor's edge. Shaq had seen ambition before. He had witnessed countless people claw their way up, driven by fame, greed, ego. But Delilah's fire was different. It wasn't greedy or entitled. It was desperate. A fierce defiance against a world that had slammed doors in her face and dared her to stay broken. Through quiet conversations among the older housekeepers, words whispered over folded linens and polished silverware, the pieces began to fit together. Delilah hadn't always been a maid. Once, not long ago, she had been a college freshman, her eyes wide with promise, a scholarship in her trembling hand. She had entered the university system not just with hope, but with grit, determined to carve a place for herself in a world that barely acknowledged her existence. But systemic injustice doesn't strike with a single blow. It erodes, slow and cruel. The scholarship had covered tuition, but not the hidden costs. The textbooks she couldn't afford, the food she sometimes skipped, the endless forms written in legal language designed to confuse. Professors with cold eyes and colder grading policies had expected her to fail. When minor emergencies struck, a broken down car, a medical bill, there had been no safety net, just debt piling higher, judgment coming faster, and the heavy, unspoken message, "You do not belong here." When she finally dropped out, it wasn't with a dramatic crash. It was a slow surrender, a missed semester, a mounting unpaid balance, a letter confirming her withdrawal, sterile and final. Her dream didn't shatter all at once. It cracked, then splintered, then quietly collapsed under the weight of things no one saw. Shaq felt the story etch itself into him with the cold finality of a tattoo needle. He had known racism his entire life, faced it head-on with a mixture of stubborn pride and earned success. But to see it through Delilah's quiet resilience, to feel the sharp corners of her losses, was something different. It wasn't the overt shouted hatred the media loved to sensationalize. It was the slow poison of a system stacked against her, papered over with politeness, justified by bureaucracy, invisible to those it didn't crush. One afternoon, as the sun slanted through the massive bay windows, Shaq found himself standing by the back terrace, watching Delilah move methodically across the lawn, with a bucket and scrub brush, cleaning patio furniture no guest had touched in weeks. Her movements were mechanical, efficient, but her face was far away, lost in thought. He wondered where her mind had gone, to biology classes she would never finish, to the dorm room she had never truly called home, to the whispered promises of a future she was never meant to hold. The old anger sparked inside him. The same anger that had driven him through jeering crowds and doubting coaches, that had fueled his rise from rough beginnings to towering legend. But this time, it wasn't anger for himself. It was for her, for every dream snatched away by unseen hands, for every night she sat under flickering lights, studying words she might never get to use. The mansion, once a symbol of success, felt heavier now, as if every stone, every polished surface, every gilded frame bore witness to a different kind of wealth. Not just money, but opportunity, security, belonging, things Delilah had been denied long before she set foot in his home. Shaq realized that helping her couldn't be a casual gesture. It couldn't be a pity bonus tucked into a paycheck or a kind word handed out like charity. If he was going to lift her, it would have to be real, substantial, and most of all, private. She deserved dignity, not headlines, strength, not rescue. But even as he wrestled with the logistics, how to fund classes quietly, how to shield her from gossip, how to give her a real shot, a darker current stirred beneath the surface. Not everyone in the mansion was blind to the attention Delilah was beginning to draw. Whispers had started to ripple through the house like smoke, rumors fueled by envy, prejudice, and the simple human hunger to tear down what threatens to rise. Shaq could feel it coiling in the air, attention growing louder. With every stolen hour Delilah spent bent over her textbooks. Resentment doesn't need a reason, it just needs a target. And in this house of polished privilege, she had painted herself red with ambition. He leaned against the terrace rail, fists clenching unconsciously, as he watched her scrub away years of weathered grime. She didn't know she was being watched. She didn't know a storm was gathering behind her back, building slowly, waiting for the right moment to Shaq made a silent vow then, a promise etched deeper than any oath he had ever spoken aloud. He would stand between her and the storm. He would shield her dreams with the same ferocity he guarded his family, his legacy, his soul. Because dreams like Delilah's were rare, fragile, stubborn, luminous, and in a world so eager to crush them, protecting one became an act of rebellion, an act of redemption. In the days that followed, Shaq carried the weight of his silent decision like a stone tucked deep inside his chest. He moved through his routines as expected, smiling at business partners, greeting guests at charity functions, posing for endless selfies with adoring fans. But beneath the public persona, a private war was raging. Helping Delilah wasn't a question anymore. It was a certainty, as natural and urgent as breathing. But helping her the right way, a way that didn't humiliate, didn't expose, didn't transform her into some pity project, would take precision, and it would take secrecy. He watched her with new eyes now, not from a place of superiority, but solidarity. Every rag she wrung out, every bucket she lifted, every faded textbook she stole moments to read, reminded him what was at stake. She wasn't asking for rescue. She wasn't asking for anything at all. That was what made her different, and what made helping her not charity but justice. Shaq started making quiet moves behind the scenes. He contacted an old friend, a dean at a community college not far from Windermere, a man who owed him a few silent favors. No headlines, no announcements. Shaq insisted. He needed someone who could admit a bright, determined student under a scholarship that didn't bear his name, didn't attach a celebrity spotlight to her every move. Anonymous support, pure and clean, like rain washing over parched earth. The dean hesitated. These things always had strings, but Shaq's voice, low and steady over the phone, left no room for argument. He wasn't asking. He was setting a foundation stone in place, one Delilah could climb without ever knowing who had built it for her. It wasn't pride that drove him to keep it secret. It was something deeper, something about dignity. Her dream had to be hers alone, not a trophy hung from his wall. Meanwhile, back inside the mansion, the tension grew thicker. Staff members who once ignored Delilah now watched her with thinly veiled suspicion. The atmosphere turned brittle, conversations tightening when she entered a room, laughter dying in her wake. It wasn't what she did, it was what she represented. A break in the invisible order of things. A reminder that ambition didn't belong only to those born into privilege. Shaq noticed the glances, the whispers, the way house meetings turned a shade colder. But he said nothing yet. He let the housekeepers and groundsmen talk. Let them poison themselves with their own smallness. He wasn't about to betray Delilah's efforts by making a show of defense. She didn't need a public champion. She needed an invisible shield. Each morning, he found reasons to linger in places where she worked. In the gardens where she trimmed hedges with mechanical precision. In the laundry room, where she folded towels with military care. In the great hall, where she polished the massive floors on her knees. He didn't interfere, didn't hover. He was simply present, a quiet counterweight against the growing resentment in the house. His presence was a signal, one not lost on the other staff. She mattered, and in a place ruled by status and silent hierarchies, that mattered more than words ever could. But even with his silent protection, Delilah seemed to shrink a little more, each day, drawing tighter into herself, as though bracing for a blow she could already feel coming. She moved with even greater caution now, eyes constantly flicking around rooms, measuring the air for threats. It was the behavior of someone who had been betrayed before, someone who knew that kindness often wore masks. Shaq hated it. Hated the way the mansion, once a haven of achievement, had curdled into a battleground of invisible knives. He had built this fortress to shield himself and his family from the world's cruelties. But inside these walls, those same cruelties had found new soil to grow. One evening, long after the last of the guests had left, and the house had slipped into its quiet night rhythm, Shaq stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, looking out over the moonlit grounds. His reflection stared back at him, not Big Shaq the icon, the giant, the businessman, but the boy who had once crouched in corners of cracked playgrounds, overhearing whispers about how he would never make it, how he would always be less. Delilah was carrying that same burden, and Shaq knew better than anyone that sometimes the worst battle was the one no one saw you fighting. A quiet knock at the study door jolted him from his thoughts. It wasn't a maid or a butler, it was a courier, dropping off an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a formal letter of admission to the community college, tuition and books fully covered by an anonymous scholarship. A note clipped to it read simply, "Candidate pre-approved, class registration pending." Shaq folded the letter carefully, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The first step was done. The door had been cracked open. Now Delilah had to walk through it. But the hardest part lay ahead, telling her somehow without telling her too much, offering her a way forward without making her feel owned, indebted, exposed, and doing it without drawing the snakes out of the grass too soon. He thought about simply leaving the letter somewhere she would find it, anonymous and clean. But that felt wrong. Cowardly, even. Delilah deserved more than a secret benefactor. She deserved someone who believed in her enough to stand behind the choice openly, if she needed it. He would find the right way. Not tonight. Not rushed. Timing would be everything. As Shaq tucked the letter into a drawer, locking it with a heavy click, he made a silent promise to the darkened room, to the house that had both sheltered and failed so many dreams before hers. He would not let Delilah Hartman slip away into the cracks. Not while he had breath to lend her. Not while he still remembered what it felt like to carry a broken dream inside a world too blind to see it. In the end, the real weight of a life wasn't measured in trophies or records. It was measured in the quiet promises you kept when no one else was watching. And Shaq O'Neal intended to keep this one, even if it cost him everything. The storm didn't strike all at once. It gathered slowly, in the poisoned breath of whispered conversations, in the tightened smiles of the housekeepers, in the lingering glances that hardened into suspicion. Shaq had seen it before, in locker rooms and boardrooms alike, the way envy grew roots in silence, watered by fear and ignorance. It started in the corners, behind closed pantry doors, under the dim lights of staff corridors, where ambition and resentment festered together like mold. Delilah became a target without lifting a finger. Her crime was invisible, stitched into the very fabric of who she was. A young woman who dared to want more in a world that had already decided how much she deserved. The fact that Big Shaq, the master of the house, took notice of her at all, was enough to stir old insecurities in people who had long ago accepted their place. Every glance Shaq gave her, every moment he lingered too long in her workspace, fed the ugly machine grinding into life behind the scenes. It wasn't about what had happened. It was about what they thought might happen. The staff, a tight-knit circle bonded by years of shared service, began to whisper louder. Stories twisted themselves into new shapes. Delilah wasn't just studying at night now. She was plotting. She wasn't just ambitious. She was manipulative. They painted her as a schemer, a social climber using pity and proximity to Big Shaq as stepping stones. And in the venomous undercurrent of these conversations, an even uglier note sounded. The unspoken resentment that someone like her, with her background, her skin, her struggle, might be lifted higher while they remained stagnant. Shaq caught snatches of it sometimes, the way a man senses an incoming punch before it lands. The house manager, Mr. Kilroy, a man who wore his superiority like a badge, began making clipped remarks about maintaining professionalism among staff. Mrs. Doyle, the senior maid who had worked in the house since before Shawnee moved out, tightened her already strict rules, scrutinizing Delilah's work with an intensity that bordered on hostility. Even the young groundskeepers, who had once joked with easy camaraderie, now watched her with guarded, distrustful eyes. Shaq saw it all, but said nothing. Not yet. He understood better than most that timing was everything. Confront the storm too early, and it only grew stronger. Let it think you were blind, and sometimes you could steer it into the rocks before it ever reached you. Meanwhile, Delilah carried on, outwardly untouched, but the tension hung around her like a second skin. She moved with careful precision, never speaking unless spoken to, never lingering longer than necessary. If she noticed the way conversations died when she entered a room, or the way cleaning assignments were quietly shifted to burden her with the hardest tasks, she gave no sign. She swallowed it all, the slights, the suspicion, the slow creeping hostility, and kept her eyes on the ground, her hands busy. But Shaq could see the cracks forming. She moved a little stiffer each day, shoulders hunched slightly tighter, as though trying to make herself smaller, harder to hit. Hope was a fragile thing, and even the strongest spirit could bleed from 1,000 tiny cuts. He spent long nights in his study, wrestling with the weight of the situation. It would have been easy to flex his power, to summon the staff one by one, and demand loyalty, or obedience. But that wasn't the solution. Fear-based loyalty was brittle, false. It wouldn't protect Delilah when she needed real allies. No, he needed something subtler, smarter. He needed to find a way to weather the storm without feeding it. The risk was real, and growing. Shaq knew how fast public perception could turn. If even a whiff of scandal attached itself to Delilah, favoritism, inappropriate conduct, whatever ugly version the staff's gossip could spin, it wouldn't just hurt her. It would crush her completely, and it would cost him too. Sponsors, headlines, reputations, all vulnerable to the casual cruelty of a whisper amplified by a hungry world. The mansion, once his fortress, now felt like a chessboard. Every move had to be calculated, every response measured. Protect her too openly, and he would validate the rumors. Distance himself completely, and she would be left to the wolves. The balance was knife-thin, and perilous. Tension finally snapped in a moment, so small it might have gone unnoticed in another world. One afternoon, as Shaq returned from a meeting, he crossed paths with Mrs. Doyle in the hallway. She offered a brittle smile, but her eyes slid past him to where Delilah knelt, scrubbing a stubborn stain from the marble floor. Shaq paused, watching as Mrs. Doyle deliberately dropped a heavy silver tray onto the carpet, scattering polished utensils across the pristine hallway. Delilah froze. For a heartbeat, the house seemed to hold its breath. Without a word, she set down her brush, stood, and began gathering the utensils, her hands steady despite the humiliation burning around her like wildfire. Shaq felt a slow, dangerous anger coil inside him, a kind of cold, patient fury he hadn't tasted since his earliest days fighting for respect on courts where every foul went unnoticed. If your skin was dark enough. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He bent down, towering frame folding with ease, and helped Delilah pick up every single piece of silver, wordlessly, deliberately, in full view of everyone. When they stood, Mrs. Doyle's face was a carefully arranged mask, but the tremor in her hand betrayed her. Shaq handed Delilah the last fork and offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then he walked away, leaving a silence behind him thicker than any shouted reprimand. The message was clear. I see you. I stand with you. But he knew the storm wouldn't retreat so easily. It would shift, grow meaner, strike in subtler ways, and he would have to be ready, because the battle for Delilah's future had only just begun, and in a world sharpened against her very existence, even the smallest kindness carried the weight of rebellion. Shaq was ready to fight that quiet war. He only prayed Delilah's spirit would survive the crossfire. The betrayal didn't come in whispers this time. It crashed into daylight, brutal and calculated, and left the air around the mansion heavy with the scent of bloodless warfare. It happened on a Saturday morning, when the estate was alive with its usual quiet bustle, groundskeepers trimming hedges, maids dusting chandeliers, the kitchen filling with the smell of fresh bread rising in the ovens. Shaq had planned a meeting with his foundation team that morning, a strategy session about the upcoming youth scholarship drive, a cause close to his heart. But as he stepped onto the marble foyer, a sudden commotion snapped his attention away from business. Voices rose, sharp, brittle, breaking the sacred code of discretion that usually blanketed the mansion. A small crowd had gathered in the grand hallway near the staff entrance. Shaq moved closer, the knot tightening in his chest even before he could make out the words. Delilah stood at the center of the storm, her face pale but set like stone. In her trembling hands, she held a sheaf of papers, pages photocopied from her battered nursing textbooks, personal notes, scholarship applications, all now scattered at her feet like debris after a hurricane. Above the scattered mess, Mrs. Doyle stood with arms crossed, a cold, triumphant gleam in her eyes. Beside her, Mr. Kilroy clutched a clipboard, looking every bit the loyal bureaucrat, ready to sanitize the situation for management. The accusation was already out in the open before Shaq even reached them. Delilah had been using company resources for personal gain, a breach of trust so scandalous it sent whispers through the staff ranks like a brush fire. It was a manufactured crime, a technicality twisted into a noose. Shaq could see it as clearly as he saw the fear written across Delilah's rigid frame. Someone had gone through her cleaning cart, rifled through her things while she worked elsewhere. Someone had planned this humiliation, timed it for when the house was busiest, when the most eyes would see, when the wound would cut deepest. For a long beat, the world seemed to slow around Shaq, his fists clenched at his sides, nails biting into his palms. Everything in him screamed to step in, to roar against the injustice, to tear the smug satisfaction off their faces with the weight of his presence. He had built this home to be a sanctuary, not a theater for cruelty, and now it was being used to crush a spirit he had promised himself to protect. But he hesitated not from fear but from calculation. He had learned the hard way that rage, however righteous, could be weaponized against you. If he charged to her defense now in front of all these watching eyes, it would only confirm the worst rumors. It would brand her not just as an object of charity, but as a scandal, a symbol of favoritism she might never outrun. The very act of protection could destroy the future he was trying to secure for her. Delilah bent slowly, gathering the papers with mechanical hands, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Her dignity remained intact, but it was fraying at the edges, and Shaq felt each frayed thread pull tighter around his own heart. He realized, in that agonizing moment, that trust wasn't just about protecting someone when it was easy. It was about standing still when every instinct demanded action, trusting them to weather a blow, because stepping in would do more harm than good. He stayed rooted to the floor, jaw set, muscles trembling with restraint. He watched as she finished gathering her things, as she straightened up and faced Mrs. Doyle, with a calm so profound, it cut deeper than any outburst could have. Delilah didn't apologize. She didn't beg. She simply held her papers against her chest and waited, silent and steady. Mrs. Doyle, sensing the shifting tide, faltered. She had expected a scene. She had expected tears, or accusations, or a grand rescue that would vindicate her suspicions. Instead, she found herself staring into the unblinking resilience of someone who had survived far worse humiliations than this. The crowd began to dissolve, awkward glances darting away. The performance was over, and it hadn't delivered the satisfaction they craved. Shaq let them scatter, saying nothing, offering no judgment or defense. His silence wasn't abandonment. It was trust, raw and unspoken. Later, after the house fell back into its usual rhythm, Shaq found Delilah in the laundry room, folding towels with mechanical precision. Her hands moved steadily, but her face was blank, carved into stillness by the weight of what had happened. He didn't speak. He simply leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, heart hammering a slow, deliberate beat of shared understanding. He wanted to tell her she had done everything right, that she had faced their worst and stood taller than any of them, that she had proven herself stronger in that moment than most people ever were in a lifetime. But words felt small against the enormity of what she had endured. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, a silence that for once spoke of solidarity instead of judgment. Delilah folded another towel, then another. Then she looked up at him, eyes clear, shining not with tears, but with a defiant kind of pride. She gave a single tiny nod, a nod that said she understood, that she knew he had been there, that she forgave the necessary cruelty of his silence. Shaq exhaled slowly, tension bleeding from his frame. He nodded back, a gesture so small it barely moved the air, but it carried the weight of 1,000 promises. They had crossed a threshold that day, built a bridge between two lonely islands with nothing but trust and resilience. It was fragile still, easily shattered, but it was real. And in a world as cold and hungry as this one, that was everything. It didn't take long for the fire to catch. By Monday morning, the halls of the mansion buzzed with an energy far more dangerous than before. Not whispered resentment now, but open defiance. Lines were drawn without a single word spoken. Staff members who once performed their duties with robotic efficiency now hesitated when summoned, their glances cold, measuring. Mrs. Doyle, emboldened by her public spectacle against Delilah, moved through the house like a queen atop the ruins she had helped create. Even Miss Gilroy, ever the stoic administrator, had adopted a smug, detached air, confident that the hierarchy had been restored. The blow, when it finally fell, came without warning. Shaq found Delilah outside by the service entrance, a battered duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her uniform folded neatly across her arm. The head of human resources, an outsider brought in by corporate necessity, not loyalty, stood awkwardly to the side, avoiding eye contact. A few official words were spoken, meaningless and hollow. Violation of house policies, creating discomfort among staff, detriment to workplace harmony. Shaq heard them all but processed none of it. His focus was locked on Delilah's face, her storm gray eyes hollow, her spirit battered but somehow unbowed. She had been fired, neatly, efficiently, without a single confrontation, without a single chance to defend herself. On paper it was a clean decision. In reality, it was a lynching carried out with smiles and signatures. Shaq felt fury ignite inside him, so sharp and cold it burned. He wanted to tear down the walls of his own house, to roar against the hypocrisy that allowed mediocrity to hide behind the thin veil of procedure. He wanted to name names, to shame every one of them who had stood by and watched a young woman's dream be ground into dust. But he knew, deep in his bones, that outbursts would only tighten the noose they had slipped around Delilah's neck. Public battles were fought with swords. Private wars required scalpels. Delilah didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, offered a small polite nod to the HR representative, and turned toward the parking lot. Shaq moved before he thought, stepping forward, reaching out, but she stopped him with a glance that said, "Let me leave with what's left of my dignity." And so he did the hardest thing he had ever done. He let her go. The backlash started immediately. News traveled fast among the circles Shaq had long outgrown, but could never fully leave behind. The polished executives, the brand managers, the media handlers always ready to feed on vulnerability. Whispers about the incident at the mansion leaked into meetings and charity galas, distorted and sharpened with every telling. Words like inappropriate involvement, poor judgment, reputational risk floated into conversations like smoke choking the air before anyone even dared to speak Shaq's name aloud. Sponsorship calls that once came with eager promises now came weighted with concern. Quiet suggestions were made, maybe a public statement distancing himself from the incident, maybe a carefully crafted apology for any misunderstandings. It wasn't about guilt, they said. It was about optics. about preserving the brand. Shaq rejected every one of them. He refused to hang Delilah out to dry to protect his own comfort. He would not play their game of soft betrayals and polite assassinations. He had made a silent promise, and whether she knew it or not, he would honor it, even if it cost him everything he had built. Friends he thought were solid began to slip away, their texts unanswered, their invitations drying up. Charity boards he once chaired began to sideline him. Reporters starved for scandal hovered at the edges of his public appearances, eager for a misstep they could turn into a headline. The house itself, once a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage, every corner echoing with betrayals too polite to name. For the first time in years, Shaq felt the cold edge of isolation he had known as a young man just starting out. The sense that no matter how high you climbed, the fall was always waiting. And now, standing at the summit, he found the air thinner, the ground more treacherous than he had ever imagined. He could have fixed it all with a few words. He could have played the game, distanced himself from Delilah, let the story die and rebuilt his public image from the ashes. But every time he thought about it, he saw her face, the look in her eyes when she gathered those scattered papers off the marble floor, the unspoken dignity in the way she carried herself out of the only place that had offered her even a flicker of a second chance. There were worse things than losing money. Worse things than losing fame. Losing your soul was one of them. Shaq knew Delilah was out there somewhere now, trying to rebuild again from nothing, carrying the weight of a shattered dream that had been snatched from her grasp at the moment it had seemed most within reach. And he knew with a certainty that burned deeper than any business deal or court victory, that he hadn't done enough. Not yet. Loyalty wasn't about standing with someone when it was easy. It was about standing when the world shoved you to your knees, and still refusing to let go. The mansion grew quieter in the weeks that followed, but not with peace. It was the silence of a battlefield after the soldiers have fled, the scorched emptiness of ground where something precious had been lost. Staff came and went, filling their roles with robotic precision, but Shaq moved among them like a ghost, a man still fighting a war long after the banners had fallen. Ashes and ashes. That was all that remained now. But in the heart of those ashes, a small ember still glowed, stubborn, defiant, waiting for breath strong enough to fan it back into flame. And Shaq O'Neal, battered but unbroken, intended to find that breath. Because some promises were too sacred to break, and some dreams were too vital to bury. The path back wasn't paved with grand gestures or sweeping victories. It was built in small, grueling steps, each one harder than the last, each one demanding more patience, more faith, more stubborn, breathless grit than Shaq had ever known. Public life had taught him how to survive the roaring arenas, the flashing cameras, the tidal waves of public opinion. But rebuilding something so fragile, so easily crushed, demanded a different kind of strength, a quieter, fiercer endurance. Delilah disappeared from the public eye as neatly as a dropped stone sinking into still water. There were no news articles chronicling her fall, no viral sympathy campaigns, no crowds rallying to her side. She was simply gone. To the world she had never mattered enough to notice. To Shaq she was the ember still glowing in the ashes, and he refused to let the world snuff it out. He moved carefully, working through the same old college contact he had leaned on before. A different scholarship was arranged, one with no visible connection to him, buried beneath layers of anonymity. Housing was secured through a low-income assistance program he quietly funded from a shadow account. Every step was built to be invisible, designed to protect her pride, to make it seem like she had found these breaks on her own. It was a delicate game, helping without being seen, lifting without leaving fingerprints. And through it all, Delilah fought. Shaq glimpsed her battle in pieces. In the monthly reports the college dean slipped to him under the radar. In the occasional scholarship updates that crossed his desk hidden beneath stacks of foundation paperwork. Delilah was enrolled in full-time classes again, juggling shifts at a local diner to cover expenses her aide couldn't stretch to meet. She was passing every course with gritted teeth and sheer willpower. Her professors noted her hunger to learn, her unyielding focus. They had no idea the mountain she was climbing, no idea the weight she carried on her shoulders, heavier than any backpack of textbooks. Publicly Shaq kept his distance. It hurt more than he admitted. The necessity of pretending she didn't exist while she scraped her way toward a future that had once seemed permanently locked away. But he understood the stakes. In a world still eager to tear down anything it couldn't control, keeping her invisible was the only real protection he could offer. His own battles continued, quieter now but no less bruising. Sponsorships lost in the wake of the rumors didn't return. Relationships fractured by silent judgments stayed broken. Shaq didn't bother explaining himself. Some truths didn't need defending. He poured his energy into his charity work with new ferocity, funding scholarships for kids no one would otherwise see, building programs in forgotten neighborhoods, lifting others in the same way he had once promised himself he would, if he ever made it out. And yet, in the stillness between battles, doubt gnawed at him. Was he really helping Delilah? Or was he simply prolonging a fight she could never truly win? The system was vast, merciless. Talent wasn't always enough. Determination wasn't always enough. Sometimes, no matter how hard you climbed, the mountain simply didn't want you to reach the top. But every time the fear whispered its poison, Shaq reminded himself of the look in her eyes, not when she was defeated, but when she gathered those scattered papers in the mansion hallway. That was not the face of someone who surrendered. That was the face of someone who knew how to rebuild herself from the dust of broken dreams. Months blurred into each other. Seasons turned. The world moved on, indifferent to the quiet war waged in classrooms and diner kitchens, and sleepless nights under flickering fluorescent lights. Shaq tracked Delilah's progress with the careful pride of a gardener watching the first green shoot break through winter-frozen ground. A B+ on a brutal anatomy midterm, an A in ethics, a commendation from a clinical instructor who described her as relentless, meticulous, unshakable. She was rising, inch by agonizing inch. But the climb was never smooth. Delilah faced new hurdles. Professors who doubted her, classmates who dismissed her, employers who exploited her need for extra shifts. The world hadn't softened just because she dared to dream again. If anything, it hardened further, testing her resolve at every turn. Every minor setback felt like a potential final blow. Every sleepless night another dare to quit. And still, she didn't quit. Shaq's own life, once so defined by public triumphs, narrowed in focus. He no longer cared for the red carpets or the endorsement deals. His real victories now lived in the shadows, in the quiet satisfaction of watching someone else, someone the world had tried to erase, carve her initials into stone, one stubborn letter at a time. Sometimes, late at night, he found himself standing alone in the same kitchen, where he had first glimpsed Delilah, under the golden light of a single lamp, studying with the desperation of a soul, not ready to die. The memory was a beacon, and a burden. It reminded him of everything she still stood to lose, and everything they still had left to fight for. The day the acceptance letter came, Shaq wasn't there to see it. He only heard later, through the cautious whisper of a friend at the college, that Delilah had been admitted into the advanced nursing program, a place reserved for the best, the most determined, the ones who didn't just dream, but bled for their future. She had done it, on her own terms, against odds that would have broken most people. He sat alone in his office when he heard, staring at the paperweight his mother had once given him, engraved with the words, "Strength grows in the places no one sees." He allowed himself one smile, small and full of an ache sweeter than any trophy he had ever lifted. The longest climb wasn't over. There would be more battles ahead. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Shaq knew, with the full blazing certainty of a soul forged in struggle, that they were winning. Slowly, quietly, fiercely. And nothing, not prejudice, not injustice, not the easy cruelty of the world, would take this victory away. Not this time. Victory, when it came, didn't crash in with fireworks or fanfare. It arrived quietly, tucked inside a thin envelope bearing the seal of one of the most prestigious nursing schools in the state. Delilah held it in her hands, numb and disbelieving. The afternoon sunlight filtering through the diner window where she worked her shifts after classes. She opened it slowly, her breath locked inside her chest, reading the words once, twice, a third time before the truth finally sank into her bones. She had been awarded a full scholarship for the remainder of her nursing degree. Tuition, books, supplies, everything covered. It should have felt like the end of the story, the final glorious triumph after a long and brutal climb. But life never handed out clean victories. Not to people like her, not without demanding one final leap of faith, one last brutal test of strength. News of the scholarship spread faster than wildfire through the college's tight circles. Professors who once barely noticed her now offered brittle smiles. Classmates who had ignored her struggle now spoke her name with either envy or suspicion. It was the kind of attention Delilah had never sought, and it brought with it a tidal wave of scrutiny she wasn't prepared for. Questions began to surface, ugly and insidious. Whispers suggesting she hadn't earned her success. That someone powerful, someone connected, must have rigged the system in her favor. Her history at Shaq's mansion, the rumors that had never fully died, rose back from their shallow graves, cloaked in new resentment. People who had never lifted a hand to help her now demanded explanations for how she had dared to rise. For Shaq, the firestorm was an echo of the battles he thought he had already fought and won. As the old rumors flared back to life, he faced the same strategic choice that had haunted him all along: protect her openly and risk tainting everything she had built, or stay in the shadows and trust her to withstand the storm without him. He chose silence again, but this time it shredded him. Watching her struggle alone, knowing that a single word from him could silence the doubters, but would also strip away the legitimacy she had bled for, was a slow torture. He understood now that sometimes love, true, fierce, selfless love, meant letting someone fight their own battles, even when every instinct screamed to step in. Delilah bore the accusations with the same stoic dignity she had worn like armor since the day she left the mansion. She didn't lash out. She didn't explain herself. She simply kept showing up to class, to her shifts, to the quiet hours of study that stretched long into the night. She let her work speak where words would have only fed the fire. But the final blow came not from her peers, not even from the whispered rumors, but from the scholarship board itself. A formal review was announced, a routine audit they called it, to ensure all awards were granted, based on merit and fairness. On paper, it sounded neutral. In reality, it was a noose disguised as protocol. Shaq watched from the sidelines, heart hammering with helpless rage. He knew the truth. No audit had been launched against the dozens of other students who had received scholarships that year. Only Delilah, only the girl who had no family connections, no polished pedigree, no lineage the establishment could accept without suspicion. The review panel demanded interviews, essays, proof beyond proof of her qualifications. They combed through her academic records, her work history, even her personal life, looking for any crack they could wedge open wide enough to justify rescinding the award. It wasn't about fairness, it was about making an example out of her, about teaching her, and anyone else like her, that some dreams, no matter how hard you fought, were still forbidden. The night before her final hearing, Delilah sat alone in the campus library, her notes spread out before her like the scattered pieces of a life she was fighting desperately to hold together. Shaq stood outside, hidden by the heavy oak door, watching her through the pane of glass. She was exhausted, hunched over her papers, her hand trembling slightly as she underlined passages in her textbook. Yet her face was set in that same defiant calm he had first recognized all those months ago. It was in that moment that Shaq understood the true weight of faith. Faith wasn't blind belief in happy endings. It was choosing to believe in someone even when the odds screamed otherwise. It was staking your soul on the slim chance that courage and persistence could, just maybe, bend the world a little closer to justice. The next morning, Delilah stood before the review board, alone. She answered every question with quiet, unshakable strength. She laid out her academic achievements, her financial struggles, her unpaid overtime hours at the diner. She spoke the truth with no embellishments, no apologies. She dared them to see her, fully, clearly, and still find her unworthy. The panel deliberated for hours. Shaq sat in his car parked outside the administration building, engine off, phone silent, waiting with a stillness that felt like balancing on a blade's edge. When the decision finally came, it arrived not with a roar, but with a quiet knock on the glass of his window. Delilah stood there, her acceptance letter clutched in her hand, her eyes shining with something more powerful than triumph, a battered, battle-hardened kind of joy. She had won, not because he saved her, not because the system showed mercy, but because she refused to be erased. Shaq stepped out of the car, towering and silent, as Delilah raised the letter high between them, like a victory banner. They didn't embrace. They didn't shout. They simply stood there in the Florida sun, breathing in a moment that belonged only to them. Beyond the court, beyond fame, beyond the towering gates of privilege. This was the leap of faith they had taken together, and they had made it. Not because the world bent for them, but because they bent themselves into something the world could no longer ignore. There was something different in the air that evening, something sharper, brighter, as if the very weight of the sky had shifted. Shaq stood on the balcony of his mansion, the city lights glittering in the distance like a constellation of possibilities. And for the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, without the old weight pressing against his ribs. The battles they had fought, silent, brutal, invisible to the world, were not for trophies or headlines. They were for moments like this, moments when simply standing, simply surviving, was the greatest act of victory. Delilah had done more than survive. She had triumphed. Not through shortcuts, not through handouts, but through a quiet, relentless fire that even betrayal, prejudice, and isolation couldn't snuff out. Her final semester report had arrived that afternoon, tucked inside a plain envelope. She had finished top of her class, earning honors reserved for the rare few who defied every expectation stacked against them. No scandal could touch her now. No rumor could drag her down. She had built a legacy on the ruins they had tried to bury her under. Brick by unbreakable brick. Shaq traced the lines of the letter with a thick finger, feeling the embossed college seal as if it were something sacred. In a way it was. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was proof that light, real light, could survive even the darkest winters. The house behind him was quiet. The staff had changed over the months. The old order quietly dismantled, replaced with people who understood, instinctively, that dignity wasn't a favor handed out to the few, but a right owed to everyone who walked through these gates. It wasn't about politics or appearances anymore. It was about principle, about building a home that could heal instead of harm. Shaq reflected on how much he had changed too. There had been a time when he measured success by trophies hoisted and crowds roared, by the size of his contracts and the reach of his empire. But helping Delilah had cracked something open inside him, something raw and essential that fame had once smothered. It wasn't about saving her. She didn't need saving. It was about standing beside her when she needed space to rise. About trusting that giving someone a foothold wasn't charity. It was justice. It was humanity. And in the end, it wasn't her who had been rescued. It was him. She had taught him that strength wasn't in the walls he built to protect himself. It was in the hands he offered to someone else when no one was looking. Later that night, a knock echoed at the front door. Shaq descended the grand staircase slowly, a strange anticipation tugging at him. When he opened the door, Delilah stood there, not in a maid's uniform or scrubs, but in a simple dark blue dress, her hair pulled back, her posture straight and proud. She held a small gift bag in one hand, her smile tentative but steady. Without a word, she stepped inside and handed him the bag. Inside was a frame, rough wood, simple glass, and behind it, a photograph. It showed a worn, beaten textbook open on a kitchen counter, the soft golden light of a single lamp illuminating the pages. A memory captured a moment that had seemed so small then, but had changed everything. Shaq's throat tightened. He looked up, meeting her eyes, and for a long moment, they just stood there, no words necessary between them. Delilah finally spoke, her voice stronger than he had ever heard it. She thanked him, not for saving her, not for giving her something she hadn't earned, but for seeing her, for believing when so many others had turned away. She said the words simply, without theatrics, without sentimentality, and because of that, they landed heavier, truer, etching themselves into his bones. He nodded once, too full to trust his voice, and gestured toward the living room. They sat together in the wide, quiet space, a place that had once felt so hollow but now, somehow, felt full. They talked not of the past, not of the battles fought or the scars left behind, but of the future, of her plans to work in underserved communities, to lift others as she had been lifted, to carry forward the quiet rebellion of hope. It struck Shaq then, how rare it was to be part of something that mattered beyond the flashes of fame, something that rippled outward unseen, reshaping the world in ways no award or contract ever could. Delilah stayed only a short while, long enough to bridge the gap between what was and what could be. When she left, stepping back into the Florida night, Shaq stood at the doorway and watched her go, silhouette moving steadily into a future she had earned with blood, sweat, and an unbreakable will. The night swallowed her form, but the light remained, a light they had built together in defiance of every force that had tried to snuff it out. Shaq turned back toward the house, the framed photograph still in his hand. He placed it carefully on the mantel above the fireplace, among the trophies and accolades, and memorabilia from a lifetime of victories. It belonged there, more than any golden statue or signed ball. Because in the end, it wasn't about what the world said about you. It was about the lives you touched, the battles you fought, when no one was cheering, the promises you kept when it would have been easier to walk away. Shaq smiled, a slow, deep smile that warmed him from the inside out. The world had tried to extinguish her light. They had failed, and in helping her keep it alive, Shaquille O'Neal had found something he hadn't known he was searching for all along. The best version of himself. If this story moved you, stay with us. Because real stories aren't just told, they're lived. The fight for hope, justice, and second chances never ends. And neither does our journey. Every story we share lights another fire the world can't put out. Keep walking with us. The next chapter is just getting started.